started in James 5, verse 16 last Wednesday, and we did not get out of James 5 and verse 16. In fact, we only got halfway through it. James 5, verse 16, a fairly common, fairly well-known verse. Confess your faults one to another and pray one for another. The effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. We just looked at that front half last week of confess your faults one to another and pray one for another. We ought to be confessing our faults to one another. We looked at, Alcoholics Anonymous. First step in getting over a problem is admitting that you have a problem. Then we looked at, some church discipline steps or phases, if you will, of what to do whenever a brother is in sin, but not repenting of that sin. Anyway, now we transition to the second half of James 5 and verse 16, in which James says, the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much, right? There are 3 words in English that is describing this kind of prayer. What are these 3 English words that are describing this kind of prayer? Starts with an E. Effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much. All right, so 3 words. It's only 2 words in the Greek, though. All right, effectual and fervent is 1 word in the Greek. So we're going to look at these 3 words in English, 2 words in Greek, and see exactly what kind of prayer a righteous man is capable of praying. All right, the effectual, fervent. This is a Greek word. I think we talked about this like 3 or 4 weeks ago, but I've slept since then, so I don't remember how long ago it was. But this Greek word translated the effectual, fervent prayer. The Greek word is energo, which is the Greek word from which we get our English energy. Right, so we could translate this as the energetic prayer of a righteous man. All right, what do you think James means whenever he says the energetic prayer of a righteous man? Sincere prayer, yeah. This is not just a tone-deaf prayer. Yeah. What else? Energy. Yeah, energy. Yeah. It's action. That's right. In Hebrews 4 and verse, is it 12 or 15? 12. The word of God is living. King James says quick. That's the same Greek word there. Energo. All right. So you could also translate this as living. The living prayer of a righteous man. What do you think that means? Action. Not tone deaf, not monotone. That's the word I was looking for. Monotone. What? Earnest. Yeah. What's James, the book of James, most well known for? What versus what? James 2 specifically. Faith versus works. Right. Earlier, just a couple verses before James 5 and verse 16, someone could go and look at it. I don't remember the exact verse. Just a few verses ago, James talked about the prayer of faith will save the sick. Right? So he's talking about the prayer of faith. Right? And then just a few verses later, he's talking about the prayer of energy. We might also say, and theme of James 2, the prayer of works. The working prayer of a righteous man avails much. Now, what do you think that means? What is a working prayer? It's an ongoing prayer, right? 1 Thessalonians 5:17, pray without ceasing. Yes. Yeah, as it is working. That's right. Yeah, it's working. Yeah, I didn't know that it used that word. Yeah, that's right. Effectual or fervent. Yeah. Yep. By coincidence, I was talking to our on Sunday. We were talking after services. I don't know if it was Sunday morning, Sunday evening. And I don't know how it came up, but he said he preached a sermon a few years ago in which he talked about unfinished prayers. Unfinished prayers. And the idea of, in his sermon of unfinished prayers was that sometimes we are the ones who not answer our prayers, but the answer to our prayers. That's a good way of putting it. Yeah, and that's
we are the answer to a prayer that we are fervently praying.
That's right.
Because we can do something here.
Yes, yeah. As a verse that supports the idea, Ephesians 3 and verse 20, Paul, in concluding his prayer there at the end of chapter 3 of Ephesians 3, he says, now to him who is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we ask or think through the power that worketh through us. And then he continues on with the thought into verse 21. But God is able to do exceedingly abundantly above all that we are able to ask or think. Through whom? Through us. Right? I like how Julie put it. Yeah, we're sometimes the answer to our prayers. Not that negates the purpose of prayer. It surely doesn't. Right? But mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right.
When I can do something about it, I can come to you.
That's right.
Not that I shouldn't pray that you'll forgive me, but I'm saying that I should be active on that. I should be doing it.
That's right. Yeah, we should be active on it. Going back to James chapter 2, right? James chapter 2, and laying the groundwork for this conversation on faith versus works, he asks the rhetorical he asks the question, whether it's rhetorical or not, I don't remember. What profit is it if you say, be warmed and filled and don't do anything? Right? If somebody comes in who's hungry and somebody comes in who is underclothed, and you say, be warmed and filled, have adequate clothing and have food on your belly, and you don't do anything to help supply their need, what good has it done? Right? Now, do we do that sometimes as Christians? I'm praying for you. The working prayer of a righteous man availeth much. I'm not suggesting that every prayer has to necessarily be a working prayer. In fact, I would suggest the opposite from James chapter 5. Just a few verses before, James lays out the prayer of faith will save the sick. There is a time whenever we need to pray just with faith, without works. And yet, there are some times in which we need to pray and work. Pray and work. The effectual, fervent, the energetic, the living prayer of a righteous man avails much. All right, any thoughts or questions on this first Greek word here? Effectual, fervent is our English. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, we're not the only ones working. That's right. Yeah, that's a really good point to highlight as well. Is you know what? If you're praying thinking that it's all on your shoulders, it's not a prayer of faith, right? We need a prayer of faith. Here's probably a perfect example of a man who melded these two ideas together. I don't remember if he prayed or not, but he had faith and he had works coupled with it. David, whenever he went up against Goliath, right? Did anybody else in that army have access to some slingshots and some stones? They definitely had access to the stones, didn't they? Probably they had access to the slingshots because that was a fairly common household item. I'm thinking about whenever the Assyrians went and invaded Lachish a couple centuries later, they all came in with the same kind of slingshots, right? And that was a military episode. So they may have had access to these stones and these slings. What did they not have access to? They had access to the works. What did they not have? They didn't have faith to go against the giant Goliath, right? So David perfectly melded these two ideas together. Yes, we don't need to be praying absent of faith. We don't need to leave faith out of the equation. Move mountains. If you have faith as a mustard seed, you'll be able to do this, that. Cast out demons was the reference there that Jesus was making. That also doesn't mean we can sit back and relax and let God take care of everything. Here's another example where a group of people had more faith as they prayed, but did not want to lift a finger to work. Exodus 13 or 14, right before the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, the Egyptians were coming down to massacre the Israelites, and Moses said, "Don't worry, God's going to take care of you." And then does anyone remember how God replied to Moses? "Why are you talking to me? You split the Red Sea."
Tell the people of Israel to go forward.
Yeah, just do it. Yeah. I think we brought this passage up like a month or two ago, and I told the story when we went through this in preaching school. The teacher described that Moses pulled up his Nike shorts, right? Because what's the slogan of Nike? Just do it, right? Moses pulled up his Nike shorts, and God said, "Just do it," right? And now that's all I picture anytime I think of that passage is Moses wearing some Nike shorts and saying, "Just do it," you know. No, that's what God said, right? Sometimes we just got to get up and do it, right? If it's basic, right, we should not expect the Lord to do it. Doesn't mean that it's wrong to pray about it, right? And it's definitely not wrong to pray for strength to do it, right? In the book of Acts chapter 4, is it? Where Peter is arrested and an angel breaks him out of prison. In that context, the disciples start praying for boldness to preach the word despite persecution that they might be suffering. So it's okay to pray for strength to do something. It's okay to pray for boldness to do it. But eventually, guess where the buck stops? It stops with us, right? Eventually, we got to do it, right? Eventually, we have to accomplish the Lord's will and go to work, right? Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. 1 Corinthians 3 and verse 6. I planted, Apollos watered. God gave the increase, right? God waits for us to do our part before he does his part, right? So guess what? It's time to get up and do good. Just do it, right? The working prayer of a righteous man does much. Okay, any other thoughts on working prayer? All right, let's look at that second Greek word there, which is availeth. Righteous man. Well, actually, let's look at righteous just briefly. You know, what does righteous mean? Anybody know what the word righteous means? It means to do what's right. All right. So that's morally good, right? In English, it was originally pronounced right wise. All right, that likewise or otherwise. This word was rightwise, and we English speakers, we've dumbed it down to now pronounce it just as righteous instead of rightwise. But the word still just means what is right, what is morally good, right? The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man, somebody who's doing what is morally good, somebody who is obeying the Lord, somebody who has been declared righteous. We'll be talking about that 2 weeks from this Sunday morning about being declared righteous. Somebody who has been declared righteous, that is the one who has a powerful prayer, a prayer that avails much, right? So if we're not living morally upright lives, are our prayers going to do much good? No. All right, God expects us to live morally. God expects us to live righteously. God expects us to have right morals, right? And to be practicing those right morals, right? So the living prayer of a righteous man. Here's our second word. Avails, iskuo, means strong. The effective prayer of a righteous man is very strong. All right? If you want to have a very strong prayer, you need to put it to work. You need to be righteous yourself. Otherwise, your prayers are going to be weak. They're not going to do very much good at all. Right? Any thoughts or questions on that word? We're going to look at an example of a person who had an effectual, fervent prayer, who was righteous, and therefore his prayer was very strong. But before we look at that example, any thoughts or questions on a very strong prayer? What even constitutes a very strong prayer? All right, let's look at the example. This is your last few verses, our last few verses of the book of James. Who's the example that James himself gives of this effectual, fervent prayer? Elijah. Elijah. Who's Elijah? What do we know about Elijah? He's a prophet, sometimes called the quintessential prophet, right? Quintessential meaning that when you think of a prophet, you think of Elijah. When you think of a United States president, in the past, who do you think of? Probably two comes to our minds. One's on the $1 bill and the other's on the $5 bill. Who are they? George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, right? Those are our quintessential presidents, right? The one who won the Revolutionary War and the one who won the Civil War, right? If you were an Israelite and you were thinking of a prophet, you asked a classroom full of people, name me a prophet. You know who was the number one prophet that they would name? Elijah. Elijah's the quintessential prophet, right? What else do we know about Elijah? Why would he be the quintessential prophet? Anybody know? Elijah is one of two human beings ever to have not experienced what? Death. Who's the other one? Anyone know? Also starts with an E. Enoch. They walked with God. Right? Elijah had more of a story told about his translation. Right? He was walking through the fields with his buddy Elisha, and a chariot of fire came down, and he was taken up. Right? What else is Elijah known for? You've heard her name before. You might hear her name sometimes more than you hear Elijah's name. Jezebel. Not a very good lady. Not a very good lady. And she had a husband who wasn't too good either. Anybody know his name? Ahab. He wasn't too good either. Hitlers of their day. All right. Reason I say that they're Hitlers of their day is because just like during the Nazi Holocaust of the 1930s and 40s, where Jews had to hide in people's houses in order to avoid being massacred by the government, just like that happened during the Holocaust, so it happened about, 1,200 years ago? No. 2,800 years ago. About the year 800 BC. I said 12. When I said 12, I was meaning 1200 BC. Anyway, it'd be about 800 BC was whenever Elijah lived, right? So anyway, happened in 800 BC where they literally had to hide the faithful followers of God, the faithful Jews, in caves in order so that Ahab and Jezebel did not massacre these faithful Jews, right? So you've got a prophet named Elijah who's going up against the Adolf Hitler of his day. Do you think that's going to garner some fame for generations to come? Yeah, maybe just a little fame, right? What one other story? We'll cap it off here. What one other story is Elijah most known for? That's right. That's right. Yeah, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal. They went up to Mount Carmel, and he said, Elijah built an altar to Jehovah here, put a sacrifice on it, and the prophets of Baal made an altar over here, put their sacrifice on it. And what was the challenge? What did they want their gods to do with those sacrifices? Call down fire, right? So no gasoline and matches for this sacrifice, right? The challenge was, let's see if Jehovah is going to ignite his sacrifice, or let's see if Baal is going to ignite his sacrifice. Anyone want to take a guess as to which God proved to be the real one on that occasion? Yeah, well, I think we're all in agreement here. Yeah, Baal must be sleeping. He must be going to the bathroom, right? And they cut themselves. They hooped and hollered, and they couldn't wake him up. Yeah, that's right. Elijah was a kind of a goofy guy on that occasion, right? He had them go down the mountain, down to the river to get some water, or maybe it was the seaside. Mount Carmel is in this like peninsula area right on the Mediterranean. Anyway, so he went down to wherever the water was. I don't know if it was the river or the sea. And they brought up some barrels and pushed it down. And he's like, do it again. And so he went down, he did it again, and he's like, do it again. And so he went down. So he's just toying with them, right? He's toying with them with the God. Maybe your God is sleeping. He's toying with them with the water. Oh, just keep dousing it with water, right? That's Elijah. Let's open our Bibles to the book of 1 Kings, and let's see the very first verse that we are introduced to Elijah. 1 Kings 17 and verse 1. This is the very first verse that we find Elijah. There is no context before this verse. We do not, it's not like a story of Jesus and, he was born to Joseph and Mary. It's not like that, right? Elijah, we're not told his birth story. We're not told about his childhood. We're not told about his early adulthood. He just randomly appears one day, 1 Kings 17 and verse 1. Notice how he appears, just randomly from thin air, quote unquote. 1 Kings 17 verse 1. Elijah the Tishbite and in the inhabitants of Gilead said to Ahab, as the Lord God of Israel lives, before whom I stand, there shall not be dew nor rain these years except at my word. What did he pray? No more rain. Until when? It would eventually be 3.5 years. But right now he's saying, until I say so again. Yeah. No more rain. Boy, imagine the faith to pray that your government is massacring people, and you say, you know what, until you stop, I'm going to pray to the Lord that the rain stops. You think that takes a lot of faith? Shoo-wee, that would take a lot of faith. All right, let's fast forward. Let's go to 1 Kings 18. 1 Kings 18. This is where that whole Mount Carmel scene happens, where Elijah challenges the 450 prophets of Baal. Now, just picture that for a moment. One guy against 450 people. Anybody want to stand up and ridicule 450 people who are have been willing to murder the people that you agree with, your family members? Would anybody here want to ridicule somebody like that? Boy, you think Elijah had a lot of faith? Shoo-wee, he had a lot of faith. Let's see. 1 Kings 18. Beginning in verse 39 here. We're going to read a little bit. 1 Kings 18, beginning in verse 39. This is after the fire has come down. Let's back up to verse 38. 1 Kings 18:38. The fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt sacrifice and the wood and the stones and the dust, and it licked up the water that was in the trench. Now when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces, and they said, "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." All right, little Hebrew. Jehovah is God. Jehovah is God. Not Baal. Jehovah is God. Elijah said to them, verse 40, "Seize the prophets of Baal. Do not let one of them escape." So they seized them, and Elijah brought them down to the brook Kishon. So there was a brook there. And executed them there. All right. Imagine that boldness, too, to execute 450 people in one fell swoop. Verse 41, then Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat, and drink, for there is the sound of the abundance of rain." So Ahab went up to eat and drink, and Elijah went up to the top of Mount Carmel. Then he bowed down to the ground and put his face between his knees and said to his servants, "Go up now, look toward the sea." So they went up and looked and said, "There is nothing." And 7 times he said, "Go again, go again, go again, go again." Then it came to pass, verse 44, the 7th time that he said, "There's a cloud, as small as a man's hand, rising out of the sea." How many years has it been since they've seen rain? 3.5 years. So he said, halfway through verse 44, so he said, "Go up, sit in Ahab, prepare your chariot, and go down before the rain stops you." Now it happened in the meantime that the sky became black with clouds and wind, and there was a heavy rain, so Ahab rode away and went to Jezreel. Then the hand of the Lord came upon Elijah. He girded up his loins and ran ahead of Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. First time we're introduced to Elijah, he's praying, "No more rain." The peak of Elijah's story there on Mount Carmel occurs, and guess what? Elijah prays again for there to be rain. And within a matter of just a few minutes, the sky went from just a little cloud about the size of a man's hand all the way to big thunderous, what's a storm cloud called? Cumulonimbus. big storm cloud, right? Yeah, big storm cloud. Yeah. Started raining. Yeah, 3.5 years. You think Elijah had a lot of faith? You think Elijah thought his prayer was going to be powerful? Did Elijah do anything to help his prayer along? He was obedient, yeah. He definitely didn't add anything to the weather pattern, did he? But he did his part in opposing the prophets of Baal so God could do his part. All right, let's see what James says. Let's open back to James chapter 5. James chapter 5, we're going to begin in verse 17. James 5 and verse 17. Here's the example. Elijah was a man with a nature like ours. All right, he's not any different than you and I. And he prayed earnestly that it would not rain. And it did not rain on the land for 3 years and 6 months. And he prayed again, and the heavens gave rain, and the earth produced its fruit. Elijah is a perfect example of the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man that avails much. Right? Elijah is not different than us. He may have had different temptations than what we have. Right? None of us have lived through a Holocaust at this point. Right? But even still, you know, he's just a normal guy like you and I. And he prayed full of faith, and his prayer was heard. The powerful prayer of a righteous man indeed is very strong. Here are just a few more examples that aren't here in James. Matthew 7, verses 7 through 8, Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given to you. Seek and you will find. Knock and it will be opened to you. For everyone who asks receives, and he who seeks finds, and to him who knocks it will be opened." If we just believe, and then if we just knock, if we do our part to seek it, prayers will be heard. Prayers will be answered. 1 John 5, 14 through 15. "Now this is the confidence that we have in him, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have petitions that we have asked of him." Acts 6, 2 through 4, last little passage I'll read. The apostles considered their prayers to be so powerful that they were unwilling to go and tend to other physical needs so that they could continue praying. Acts 6, 2 through 4, usually a passage that's described as them selecting the first deacons. The Bible reads, "Then the 12 summoned the multitude of the disciples and said, 'It is not desirable that we should leave the word of God and serve tables. Therefore, brethren, seek out from among you the 7 men of good reputation, full of the Holy Spirit and wisdom, whom we may appoint over this business. But we will give ourselves continually to prayer and to the ministry of the word.'" Not that the serving tables to take care of the widows was a bad use of time, but the apostles felt that a better use of their time was prayer and ministry. All right, prayer is so powerful. We ought not to hinder our prayers by not believing that our prayers are being heard, or by not getting up and helping our prayers by doing our part so God can do his part. That's all that we're going to get into tonight. We've got 3 minutes left. Any thoughts or questions before? Go ahead, Gerald. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I. Yeah. There are two um, stories in the Bible that my mind goes to a lot, and that is Elijah right after that Mount Carmel affair, and Jeremiah 1. And Jeremiah 1 is because God's calling this 20-year-old preacher to go preach, and says, "Be not afraid of their faces," right? Don't be intimidated by them. In other words, well, guess what? When I started preaching, I was 20, so I think about that a lot. But the other one, Elijah, right after that Mount Carmel episode, he was borderline suicidal, right? And this is what often happens in life, where you go from the peak of feeling you're all that and then some, literally on the mountaintop, right? Elijah was, and then just one chapter later, 1 Kings 19, he's fleeing for his life, right? And wants God to kill him. He gets so depressed that he stops eating, and the Lord has to send birds to feed him, right? And then Elijah really never recovers from that. In the same chapter, God sends Elisha to Elijah and says, "Elisha's going to replace you," And so the rest of Elijah's ministry is just spent training his successor, right? Anyway, the reason I think of that particular passage a lot is because so often we can go from a emotional high and just be brought so low that we just freeze ourselves out. In psychology, it's called an emotional freeze point, right? We have to recover from that, right? Life is full of ebbs and flows, as we put it, and we have to get back up to that point. We can't just stall out at the bottom. So, yeah, great thought, Gerald. Any other thoughts or questions or comments? We still have 20 seconds left. Go ahead, Rita. Yes, yeah. Right. Right. Yes. No food. Massacre. Yeah. Just Not the best time to be alive. Not the best time to be alive at all. Yep. Okay, any other thoughts or questions or comments? Now we're 20 seconds over. Now we're done entirely.